When Jakob Holmberg opened his cabin door at the stroke of midnight, he found his dead fiancée standing in the Montana snow, 3 years after he'd buried her with his own hands. But as supernatural wolves circle his isolated cabin and the truth behind his mysterious visitor begins to unravel, Jakob must ask himself, what price is he willing to pay for one last chance at redemption? Crash! The axe blade split the frozen wood with a sound like thunder, sending splinters flying across the snow-covered clearing. Jakob Holmberg wiped sweat from his brow despite the bitter February cold that had gripped the Montana territory for weeks. His breath came out in white puffs as he stacked another log onto the growing pile beside his small cabin. The year was 1887, and winter here felt like it could last forever. Jakob had been alone in these mountains for 17 long months. Not by choice, but because the logging crew had left him behind after the accident. The other men whispered that he brought bad luck, that working with him meant danger. They said Ben Morrison would still be alive if Jakob had been more careful with the ropes that terrible day. Now Jakob lived by himself, cutting wood and hunting small game to survive. His only company was the wind that howled through the tall pine trees at night. Sometimes he talked to himself just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. The nearest town was 3 days' ride away, and he hadn't seen another person since the snows began. His cabin was simple but sturdy, built from the same logs he'd been cutting when the crew worked these hills. Inside, a stone fireplace kept him warm, and shelves held his few belongings. Clothes, tools, a coffee pot, and some books he'd read so many times he knew them by heart. On the mantel sat one special thing, a photograph of a beautiful woman with kind eyes and a bright smile. Her name was Margaret, and she had been everything to him. Jakob picked up another log and set it on the chopping block. The axe felt heavy in his hands today, heavier than usual. Maybe it was because he'd been having the dreams again. Dreams where Margaret called his name from somewhere far away. She had died 3 winters ago from fever, back when he lived in Minneapolis. He'd held her hand as she passed, promising he would never forget her. Then he'd run west, trying to escape the pain that followed him like a shadow. Thud! Another log split clean in two. Jacob's muscles ached from the work, but he kept going. Work helped him forget, at least for a while. It kept his mind busy so he wouldn't think about how quiet everything was, how empty his life had become. The sun was getting low behind the mountains, painting the snow orange and pink. Soon it would be dark, and he would go inside to his lonely dinner and lonely fire. He would sit in his wooden chair and drink coffee that tasted like bark, listening to the wind scratch at his windows like something trying to get in. But first, he needed more wood. Winter in Montana could kill a man who wasn't prepared, and Jakob had learned to always stay ready. He lifted the axe again, muscles moving in the same pattern he'd repeated thousands of times. Split the wood, stack the wood, survive another day. A branch cracked somewhere in the forest behind him. Jakob stopped mid-swing and turned around, scanning the dark trees. Deer, probably, or maybe an elk looking for food. Animals were always moving through these woods, searching for anything they could eat in the harsh winter. But as he watched, nothing moved. The forest stood perfectly still, as if it was holding its breath. Even the wind had stopped blowing. The silence felt different somehow, not peaceful, but waiting, like something important was about to happen. Jakob shook his head and went back to his work. Living alone for so long was making him imagine things. Pretty soon he'd be seeing monsters in every shadow and hearing voices in every breeze. That's what happened to men who spent too much time by themselves in the wilderness. They started going crazy. He split 3 more logs before the feeling hit him again, the strange sense that he was being watched. This time when he turned around, he was sure he saw movement deep in the trees. Something pale that flickered between the dark trunks like a candle flame. There 1 second and gone the next. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing off the mountains. "Someone there?" Only silence answered him. Jakob waited, axe ready in his hands, but nothing appeared. The pale shape, if it had been real at all, was gone. As darkness fell over the mountains, Jakob gathered his tools and headed inside. He built up the fire and made his simple dinner of beans and salt pork, trying to ignore the feeling that something had changed. The cabin felt different tonight, smaller somehow, like the walls were pressing in on him. He ate his meal in silence, then sat in his chair with a cup of bitter coffee. The photograph of Margaret seemed to glow in the firelight, her smile as warm and loving as he remembered. Sometimes he talked to the picture, telling her about his day or asking what she thought he should do. Tonight, though, he just stared at her face and wondered if the loneliness was finally driving him mad. Outside, the wind picked up again, moaning through the trees like a lost soul. Jacob pulled his blanket tighter around his shoulders and tried to read one of his books, but the words kept blurring together. His eyes felt heavy, and soon he was nodding off in his chair. That's when he heard it. A sound that made his blood turn to ice. Footsteps in the snow outside his cabin, slow and careful, moving in a circle around his home. Jacob jerked awake and grabbed his rifle, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The footsteps stopped right at his front door. Jacob held his breath, finger on the trigger, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. Bears sometimes wandered close to cabins in winter, looking for food. Wolves traveled in packs and could be dangerous if they were hungry enough. But the footsteps he'd heard were different, too steady, too purposeful. They sounded almost human. Knock, knock, knock. 3 slow, careful knocks on his wooden door. Jacob's hands started shaking so hard he almost dropped his rifle. In 17 months of living alone, no one had ever come to his cabin. Not once. The few trappers and hunters who worked these mountains knew to stay away from the crazy Swede who talked to himself and brought bad luck to anyone who got too close. Knock, knock, knock. The sound came again, patient as death. Jacob forced himself to stand up, his legs feeling weak as water. "Who's out there?" he called, his voice cracking like a teenage boy's. "What do you want?" No answer. Just the wind whistling through the pine trees and the crackling of his fire. But Jacob could feel something on the other side of that door, a presence that made the hair on his arms stand up straight. Whatever was out there wasn't going away. He crept closer to the door, rifle raised and ready. The wooden boards creaked under his feet, sounding loud as gunshots in the silence. His free hand reached for the iron bar that held the door shut, but he stopped before touching it. Once he opened that door, there would be no going back. Once he saw what was waiting in the darkness, his life would never be the same. Knock, knock, knock. This time the knocks were softer, almost gentle, like someone who didn't want to frighten him. Jacob's mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Maybe it was another trapper, lost in the storm and looking for shelter. Maybe it was an injured animal that had learned to mimic human sounds. Maybe it was nothing at all, just his lonely brain playing tricks on him. But deep down, he knew none of those things were true. Whatever was knocking on his door at midnight wasn't natural. It wasn't normal. It was something else entirely. "I'm armed," he shouted, trying to sound braver than he felt. "I've got a rifle, and I know how to use it." A voice answered him, soft, familiar, impossible. "I know you do, Jacob. You always were good with that old gun." The rifle slipped from Jacob's numb fingers and clattered to the floor. He knew that voice. He'd heard it in his dreams every night for 3 long years. He'd heard it whisper his name as fever took her life, heard it promise to love him forever even as she grew cold in his arms. It was Margaret's voice. "That's not possible," he whispered to himself, backing away from the door. "She's dead. I buried her myself. I watched them put her in the ground." "Open the door, Jacob," the voice said again, gentle as summer rain. "Please. I've come such a long way to see you." Jacob's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. Dead people didn't come back. They didn't walk through Montana snowstorms to knock on lonely men's doors. They stayed in their graves where they belonged, leaving the living to carry on without them. But the voice sounded so real, so perfectly like his lost love. It had the same slight accent from her childhood in Norway, the same way of saying his name that had always made his heart skip a beat. If he closed his eyes, he could almost imagine they were back in Minneapolis, back when she was alive and their future stretched ahead of them like a golden road. "Jacob," the voice came again, worried now. "Are you all right? I can hear you breathing." I know you're there." His hand moved toward the door bar without his permission, drawn by a force stronger than fear. Part of him, the part that had never stopped loving her, never stopped missing her, wanted to throw the door open and pull her into his arms. But the logical part of his mind screamed warnings. This was wrong. This was impossible. This was dangerous. "You're not real," he said out loud, his voice shaking. "You can't be real. Margaret is dead." A long pause. Then, "I know I'm dead, Jacob, but love doesn't die, does it? Love finds a way to come back, especially when someone needs it most. And you need me now, don't you? You've been so lonely, so lost." Tears ran down Jacob's face. She was right. He was lonely, lonelier than any person should have to be. He was lost in these mountains, lost in his guilt and grief, lost in a life that felt more like surviving than living. If Margaret could somehow come back to him, even for one night, wouldn't that be worth any risk? "How do I know it's really you?" he asked, pressing his forehead against the cold wooden door. "Remember the day we got engaged?" the voice said softly. "You were so nervous you dropped the ring in the snow. We spent an hour looking for it. And when we finally found it, you said, 'I said I'd search the whole world for you if I had to.'" Jacob finished, the memory as clear as yesterday. Nobody else knew those words. Nobody else had been there that day. His hand closed around the door bar. Whatever was out there, ghost, dream, or miracle, it knew things only Margaret could know. It spoke with her voice, remembered their private moments, called to the part of his heart that had never healed from losing her. Jacob lifted the bar and reached for the door handle. His rational mind screamed at him to stop, to keep the door locked, to protect himself from whatever supernatural force was playing with his deepest longings. But his heart was stronger than his mind, and his heart recognized the voice of the woman he'd loved more than life itself. The door swung open, and Jacob's world changed forever. She stood there in the swirling snow, exactly as he remembered her. Dark hair fell in waves around her shoulders, and her blue eyes sparkled with tears of joy. She wore the same dress she'd been buried in, the blue wool one with tiny pearl buttons that she'd loved so much. But instead of looking like death, she looked more alive than anything in the frozen wilderness around them. "Hello, Jacob," Margaret said, and her smile was like sunrise after the longest night. "I've missed you so much." Jacob's legs gave out beneath him, and he crashed to his knees in the doorway. Margaret stepped forward quickly, her warm hands catching his shoulders before he could fall completely. The touch sent electricity through his whole body. She felt real, solid, alive. Her skin was warm despite the freezing night, and he could smell the lavender soap she'd always used. "Easy now," she whispered, helping him back to his feet. "I know this is a shock. I'm sorry I scared you." Jacob stared at her face, drinking in every detail. The small scar above her left eyebrow where she'd fallen as a child. The way her nose crinkled slightly when she smiled. The tiny mole on her neck that he used to kiss every morning. Everything was exactly right, exactly as he remembered. "How?" was all he could manage to say. Margaret glanced over her shoulder at the dark forest, then stepped inside the cabin. "May I come in? It's cold out here, and we have so much to talk about." Jacob nodded without thinking, then immediately wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. But she was already inside, looking around the small room with curious eyes. She moved to the fireplace and held her hands toward the flames, just like she always had when she was cold. "You've kept our picture," she said softly, noticing the photograph on the mantel. "I'm glad. I couldn't throw it away," Jacob admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "It was all I had left of you." Margaret turned to face him, and her expression was full of such love and sadness that it took his breath away. "Oh, Jacob, you've been so alone up here, haven't you? So hurt and angry at yourself." He wanted to deny it, to pretend he was fine, but the words wouldn't come. She could see right through him just like she always had. There was no point in lying. "The accident," he began. "Wasn't your fault," Margaret said firmly, cutting him off. "Ben Morrison climbed too high that day. You warned him the branch looked weak, but he wouldn't listen. Young men think they're impossible to hurt. Jacob's eyes filled with tears. But I was supposed to check the ropes. I was the crew leader. His family blamed me, and they were right to. Margaret moved closer, her blue eyes blazing with something that might have been anger. His family needed someone to blame because losing a son is too painful to bear without a target for their rage. But placing blame doesn't bring back the dead, Jacob. It only destroys the living. She was standing so close now that he could see the gold flecks in her eyes, could count each individual eyelash. His hand reached out without permission, fingers trembling as they touched her cheek. She felt completely real, soft skin, slight warmth, the texture of life itself. I don't understand how you're here, he said. Dead people don't just come back. They don't walk through blizzards to visit lonely cabins. Margaret's smile was mysterious. Don't they? Are you so sure about what's possible and what isn't? This is a strange land, Jacob. Old land. The native people who lived here before us knew things that white men have forgotten. They understood that the world is bigger and more mysterious than most people want to believe. Jacob pulled his hand back, sudden fear creeping up his spine. What are you saying? That you're some kind of spirit? A ghost? I'm saying that love is stronger than death, Margaret replied. I'm saying that when someone hurts as much as you've been hurting, sometimes the universe finds a way to send help. She moved to his wooden chair and sat down gracefully, her blue dress spreading around her like water. Sit with me, Jacob. Let me tell you what I've seen. Against his better judgment, Jacob sat on the floor beside her chair, just like he used to do during the long winter evenings in Minneapolis. Margaret's fingers found his hair, stroking it gently as she spoke. I've been watching you, she said. Not all the time, the dead have their own concerns, but often enough. I've seen you talking to my picture, asking me questions you think I can't answer. I've watched you blame yourself for things that weren't your fault. I've seen how the guilt is eating you alive, turning you into a ghost long before your time. Jacob closed his eyes, letting himself sink into the familiar comfort of her touch. I tried to forget. I tried to move on. But everywhere I looked, I saw reminders of what I'd lost. The bed we shared, the places we walked together, the future we'd planned. So I ran. And found yourself in an even lonelier place, Margaret observed. Oh, my darling. Running from pain doesn't make it go away. It just gives it room to grow bigger in the darkness. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the windows and making the fire dance in the fireplace. But inside the cabin, Jacob felt warmer than he had in years. Margaret was here, somehow impossibly here, and nothing else mattered. Are you real? He asked again, needing to hear her answer. Margaret's fingers stilled in his hair. What do you think, Jacob? Does it feel real when I touch you? Does my voice sound real? Does the love between us feel real? Yes, he whispered. But then maybe that's enough for now, she said gently. Maybe some questions don't need answers. Maybe some miracles don't need explanations. Jacob opened his eyes and looked up at her. She was smiling down at him with such tenderness that his heart ached. Whatever she was, ghost, dream, or impossible miracle, she was here. She was with him. After 3 years of crushing loneliness, he wasn't alone anymore. But even as he thought it, something cold touched the back of his neck. A feeling that they weren't truly alone in the cabin. That something else was watching, waiting, listening to every word they spoke. Margaret must have felt it too, because her hand froze in his hair and her smile faded. She turned toward the window, her face suddenly tense with worry. What is it? Jacob asked, starting to stand. Shoo, Margaret whispered, pressing him back down. Listen. Jacob held his breath and strained his ears. At first he heard nothing but the wind and the crackling fire. Then, faintly, came another sound. A long, mournful howl that seemed to come from every direction at once. Wolves, he said, reaching for his rifle. But they don't usually come this close to. The howl came again, closer this time, and it was answered by another from the opposite side of the cabin. Then another, and another. Soon the night was filled with an eerie chorus that made Jacob's blood run cold. Margaret stood up slowly, her face pale with fear. "These aren't ordinary wolves, Jacob. They've been following me." "Following you? What do you mean?" But before she could answer, something scratched at the window beside the fireplace. Long, deliberate scratches like claws testing the strength of the glass. "Get away from the window!" Margaret grabbed Jacob's arm and pulled him toward the center of the room. Her grip was surprisingly strong, and her face had gone completely white. "They can smell what I am." Jacob snatched up his rifle and checked to make sure it was loaded. "What you are?" "Margaret, you're scaring me." "What's going on?" Another scratch at the window, followed by a sound that made Jacob's skin crawl. Breathing. Heavy, wet breathing that fogged the glass from outside. Whatever was out there was bigger than any normal wolf. "I need to tell you something," Margaret said urgently. "Something I should have told you right away. I'm not exactly what you think I am." Crash. Something heavy slammed into the cabin's north wall, making the whole structure shake. Dust rained down from the ceiling beams, and one of Jacob's coffee cups fell off a shelf and shattered on the floor. "Tell me later," Jacob shouted, moving to cover the window with his rifle. "Right now we need to figure out how to stay alive." Through the frosted glass, he could see shapes moving in the darkness. Large, four-legged shapes that moved wrong, too fluid, too purposeful. Their eyes reflected the firelight like burning coals, and there were more of them than he could count. Another impact shook the cabin, this time on the south wall. Then the west wall. The creatures were surrounding them, testing the building's weak points like soldiers planning an attack. "They're not after you," Margaret said, her voice barely audible above the sounds of destruction. "They're after me. If I leave, they'll follow me and leave you alone." "No!" Jacob spun around to face her. "I'm not losing you again. Not to wolves or anything else. We'll fight them together." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand. These aren't normal wolves. They're something else, something hungry and ancient. They hunt things like me, things that shouldn't exist in your world." The scratching at the window grew more frantic. Jacob could see claw marks appearing in the thick glass, deep gouges that spoke of supernatural strength. Whatever was out there wanted in badly, and it wouldn't be denied much longer. "Things like you," Jacob demanded. "Margaret, what are you talking about? What aren't you telling me?" Before she could answer, the window exploded inward in a shower of glass and freezing air. A massive wolf head pushed through the opening, jaws snapping, eyes burning with intelligence that was definitely not animal. The creature was enormous, easily twice the size of any wolf Jacob had ever seen. Its fur was silver white, and when it breathed, frost formed in the air. Jacob fired his rifle, the shot booming through the small cabin. The bullet hit the wolf square in the chest, but instead of falling, the creature just snarled and pushed further through the window. Black blood oozed from the wound, steaming in the cold air, but the wolf kept coming. "Silver!" Margaret screamed. "You need silver bullets. Regular ones won't stop them." "I don't have silver bullets." Jacob backed away from the window, frantically trying to reload. "I'm a lumberjack, not a monster hunter." The wolf's massive paws found purchase on the windowsill, and it hauled its body through the opening. Standing in Jacob's cabin, it was even more terrifying, easily 6 feet long, with muscles that rippled under its pale fur. Its yellow eyes fixed on Margaret with unmistakable hunger. But instead of attacking immediately, it spoke. The words came out distorted by its wolf mouth, but they were definitely human words. "Give us what we want, dead one, and the human lives." Jacob's rifle fell from nerveless fingers. Wolves didn't talk. Wolves didn't make deals. Whatever this thing was, it definitely wasn't natural. "I won't bargain with you," Margaret said, stepping protectively in front of Jacob. "Find another way to cross over." The wolf laughed. Actually laughed. A sound like grinding bones. "There is no other way, and you know it. The barrier grows stronger each year. Soon there will be no crossing at all. Give us your place in his world, and we will let you both die quickly." Jacob's mind reeled as he tried to process what he was hearing. Crossover? Barriers? What place in his world? Nothing made sense anymore. "Margaret," he said slowly. What is it talking about? She turned to look at him, and he saw guilt written all over her beautiful face. Jacob, I wanted to tell you gently. I wanted to explain properly. But there's no time now. Another wolf appeared at the broken window, and then another. Soon 3 of the massive creatures filled Jacob's small cabin, their breath fogging the air, their eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Tell me what? Jacob asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. Margaret took a deep breath. I'm not really Margaret. I mean, I am, but I'm also not. I'm something that took her form because I knew it would comfort you. I'm what the old people call a wish keeper, a spirit that helps broken hearts heal. The words hit Jacob like a physical blow. Not Margaret, not his lost love come back from the dead. Just another lie, another cruel trick played by a universe that seemed determined to destroy him piece by piece. So none of this is real, he said numbly. You're not real. The love is real, Margaret said desperately. The comfort I've given you tonight is real. The truth I've told you about Ben's death, all of that is real. I may not be your Margaret, but I am someone who cares about you, someone who wants to help you heal. The lead wolf stepped closer, its massive head swinging between them like a pendulum. Enough talk. Choose now, Wishkeeper. Give us your place, or watch the human die slowly. More wolves appeared at the window, and Jacob could hear others circling the cabin outside. They were trapped, outnumbered, and facing enemies that bullets couldn't stop. But even as fear threatened to overwhelm him, Jacob felt something else rising in his chest. Anger. You want to know something? He said, picking up his rifle again. I don't care what you are. He looked directly at the spirit wearing Margaret's face. Real or not, you came here tonight when I needed someone most. You listened to me, comforted me, told me things I needed to hear. That makes you real enough for me. He turned to face the wolves, rifle raised and ready. And you want to know something else? I've been alone for 17 months. I've survived blizzards, bears, and my own guilt trying to eat me alive. So if you think I'm going to just hand over the first friend I've had in years, you're about to learn what Montana survival looks like. The lead wolf's eyes narrowed. Foolish human, you cannot win this fight. Jacob smiled grimly. Maybe not, but I can make you earn it. Boom! Jacob's rifle exploded in a deafening roar as he fired point-blank into the lead wolf's snarling face. The creature stumbled backward, black blood spraying across the cabin walls, but it didn't fall. Instead, it shook its massive head and lunged forward with renewed fury, jaws snapping inches from Jacob's throat. The fireplace! Margaret shouted, grabbing a burning log and swinging it at another wolf that had leaped through the window. Fire hurts them. Jacob dove to the side as razor-sharp claws raked the air where his head had been. He rolled across the floor, snatching up another piece of burning wood from the hearth. The flames danced wildly as he swung it like a sword, forcing the nearest wolf to back away with an angry snarl. The cabin erupted into chaos. 3 massive wolves prowled between the furniture while more heads appeared at the broken window, yellow eyes gleaming with hunger. Margaret moved with surprising grace, wielding fire like a weapon, her blue dress swirling as she spun away from snapping jaws. There! Jacob pointed to a corner where shadows seemed deeper than they should be. Something's moving back there. A 4th wolf materialized from the darkness, not through the window, but from thin air itself. This one was different from the others, smaller but somehow more dangerous. Its fur was pure black, and frost formed on everything it touched. The Shadow Walker? Margaret whispered, her face going pale with terror. They brought their alpha. The black wolf spoke in a voice like ice cracking. End this game, Wishkeeper. You cannot protect the human forever. Give us what we seek, or watch him suffer. Jacob swung his burning log at the creature, but it simply stepped sideways and vanished like smoke. A heartbeat later, it reappeared behind him, claws raking across his back. Jacob cried out in pain as hot blood soaked through his shirt. Leave him alone. Margaret threw herself between Jacob and the shadow wolf, her hands glowing with strange blue light. Your fight is with me. Our fight is with the living world, the alpha replied, circling them slowly. We have been trapped in the realm of the dead for too long. The barrier weakens, and we smell life on this side. Fresh blood, warm hearts, souls we can possess. Jacob pressed his back against the wall, trying to understand what he was hearing. Possess? You want to take over people's bodies. The silver wolf's eyes all turned to him at once, and their synchronized stare made his blood freeze. The human begins to understand, the alpha said with satisfaction. We are spirits of the hunt, trapped between worlds. But if we can drive out a living soul, we can take its place. That's why they followed me here, Margaret said, her blue light growing brighter. They know what I am, a spirit already walking in your world. If they can force me out, one of them can take my form and use it to cross over permanently. The largest silver wolf stepped forward, muscles bunching for an attack. And once one of us crosses, we can open the way for others. Your world will become our hunting ground. Jacob's mind raced. These weren't just wolves attacking his cabin. They were some kind of supernatural army trying to invade the world of the living. And Margaret, whatever she really was, stood as the only thing between them and their goal. How many of you are there? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The alpha's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. Hundreds, thousands, every predator that has ever died angry and hungry, waiting for a chance to hunt again. We have been patient, but patience has its limits. Jacob looked at Margaret, really looked at her. The blue light around her hands was getting brighter, but he could see the strain on her face. She was powerful, but fighting this many enemies was taking everything she had. What happens if they win? He asked quietly. They pour through the gap between worlds like water through a broken dam, Margaret replied, never taking her eyes off the circling wolves. They possess the living, starting with the isolated and vulnerable. Then they spread, taking over entire towns, entire territories. The dead would rule the living. A new sound reached them from outside, more howls, but these were different. Distant, but growing closer. Many voices, all singing the same terrible song. The pack grows, the alpha observed with satisfaction. Soon there will be too many for even a wishkeeper to handle. Jacob felt despair creeping into his heart. How could they possibly fight an army of supernatural wolves? He was just a man with an empty rifle and some burning sticks. Margaret was powerful, but she was only one spirit against dozens, maybe hundreds. Then he remembered something. You said the barrier is weakening. What's causing that? The shadow wolf tilted its head, studying him with new interest. The same thing that drew the wishkeeper to you, human. Loneliness, grief. When the living give up hope, when they stop believing in life and love, they thin the wall between worlds. Your despair calls to us like a beacon. Jacob's blood ran cold as understanding hit him. My fault. This is my fault. My loneliness brought them here. No, Margaret said firmly, her light flaring brighter. Your pain made you vulnerable, but you didn't cause this. They've been looking for a way through for years. They would have found one eventually. But Jacob barely heard her. The guilt that had been eating at him for months suddenly made horrible sense. First Ben Morrison's death, now this invasion of supernatural predators. Everywhere he went, people got hurt because of his failures. The wolves sensed his emotional collapse and pressed closer, feeding on his despair. Their eyes burned brighter, and frost began forming on the cabin walls despite the roaring fire. Yes, the alpha hissed. Embrace the guilt, human. Feel how it burns. Let it consume you from within. When you are hollow with despair, we will fill the empty space. Jacob sank to his knees, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility. But as he knelt there, something caught his eye. A small object half hidden under his overturned table. At first he thought it was just debris from the fight, but then he recognized what it was. A child's wooden toy horse, carved from pine and painted red. It definitely hadn't been in his cabin before tonight. So where had it come from? Mama! A tiny voice spoke from the corner where the deepest shadows gathered. Mama, I'm scared. Everyone in the cabin, Jacob, Margaret, and all the wolves, froze at the sound. Slowly, A small figure emerged from the darkness. A little girl, maybe 6 years old, with long black hair and huge dark eyes. She wore a simple brown dress and moccasins, and she clutched the wooden horse toy to her chest like it could protect her. "Ayanna!" Margaret gasped, and Jacob heard real fear in her voice for the first time. "What are you doing here? You should be hiding." The shadow wolf's eyes blazed with sudden hunger. A child. How delicious. Young souls are so much easier to displace than adult ones. Jacob's protective instincts kicked in immediately. He struggled to his feet, placing himself between the little girl and the wolves. "Stay back. She's just a kid. Precisely why she's so valuable," the alpha said, beginning to circle toward Ayanna. "Children's minds are flexible, their spirits not yet fully formed. Perfect vessels for our kind." The little girl whimpered and pressed closer to Jacob's legs. "The bad wolves followed me here," she whispered. "I tried to hide, but they found me anyway." Jacob looked down at her, his mind spinning with questions. How had a child gotten into his cabin without him noticing? Where had she come from? The nearest town was days away, and no families lived in these mountains. "Where are your parents?" he asked gently. Ayanna's eyes filled with tears. "Gone. The sickness took them last winter. The white men at the fort said I had to go away to their school, but I ran. I've been hiding in the forest, but it's so cold and I'm so hungry." Margaret moved closer, her blue light dimming as she focused on the child. "She's been living wild for weeks, Jacob, eating berries and roots, sleeping in caves. The cold should have killed her by now. But it didn't," Jacob realized. "Something's been protecting her." The alpha wolf snarled with frustration. "The old spirits of this land. They watch over their own, even the young ones. But their power grows weak. Soon they will not be able to help her." As if summoned by the wolf's words, new sounds drifted through the broken window. Not howls this time, but something else. Drums, faint and rhythmic, coming from deep in the forest. And with the drums came other noises. Bird calls that sounded almost like words. Wind that whispered in languages Jacob had never heard. "The old ones wake," Margaret said with wonder. "The native spirits that lived here before white settlers came. They sensed the danger." The silver wolves backed away from the windows, suddenly nervous. Their confident snarls turned to uncertain whines as the drumming grew louder. Whatever was coming, even these supernatural predators feared it. "Grandfather comes," Ayanna said simply, no longer crying. "He promised he would find me when I needed him most." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air pouring through the broken window. "Grandfather? But you said your parents were dead." "Not that grandfather," the little girl explained patiently. "The other one. The one who walks between the worlds and speaks to the animals." Outside, the drumming reached a crescendo, and then stopped completely. The sudden silence was more frightening than any noise had been. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something momentous to happen. Then a new voice spoke from the darkness beyond the window, old, deep, speaking in accented English. "My granddaughter calls and I answer. Who dares threaten the children of this land?" A figure appeared in the broken window frame, but Jacob's eyes struggled to focus on it. Sometimes it looked like an old Native American man with gray braids and weathered skin. Sometimes it seemed to be a massive bear standing on its hind legs. Sometimes it was a tree with a face carved in its bark, or a pillar of wind and snow with eyes like stars. The shadow wolf hissed and began backing toward the far wall. "Shaman, this is not your concern, old one. The barrier weakens, and we have the right to cross." "You have the right to nothing in this sacred place," the figure replied, its voice making the cabin walls vibrate. "These mountains have been my people's home for 1,000 generations. I will not let hungry ghosts turn them into a hunting ground." Jacob watched in amazement as the old shaman, or whatever he was, stepped fully into the cabin without actually moving through the window. One moment he was outside, the next he stood among them, and Jacob couldn't say exactly how he'd gotten there. "You must be Ayanna's grandfather," Jacob said, though the words felt inadequate. The old man turned to look at him, and Jacob felt those ancient eyes seeing right through to his soul. I am Thomas Windwalker, yes, and you are the lonely one whose grief called to both good spirits and bad ones. I'm sorry, Jacob said automatically. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I didn't know my sadness could. Peace, young man, Thomas interrupted gently. Grief is natural. Pain is part of life. You are not to blame for having feelings, only for letting them consume you completely. Margaret stepped forward, her blue light now steady and calm. Honored elder, can you help us? These spirits seek to cross over and possess the living. Thomas Windwalker studied the wolves, who had all retreated to the corners of the cabin and were making themselves as small as possible. They seek what they have always sought, life without death, hunger without satisfaction. But they forget that some hungers can never be fed. The alpha wolf found its courage and snarled defiantly. The old ways are dying, shaman. Your people are gone, scattered to reservations and schools. Your power fades with each passing year. Perhaps, Thomas agreed calmly. But tonight, in this place, with these people who need protection, my power is enough. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out what looked like ordinary sand. But when he threw it into the air, it hung there like stars, each grain glowing with silver light. Choose now, he said to the wolves. Return to your proper place in the spirit world, or face the consequences of defying the old laws. The shadow wolf's form began to waver, becoming less solid. This isn't over, it warned. The barrier grows thinner every day. We will find another way through. But not tonight, Thomas said firmly. And not through these people. One by one, the wolves began to fade away like smoke, their angry howls growing fainter until they were just whispers on the wind. The last to go was the alpha, its yellow eyes promising future revenge before it finally vanished completely. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling of the fire and little Ayana's relieved sigh. Jacob sank into his chair, overwhelmed by everything that had just happened. Supernatural wolves, ancient shamans, spirit worlds. It was all too much for his practical lumberjack mind to process. Are they really gone? He asked. Thomas Windwalker smiled, and suddenly he looked like nothing more than a kind old man. For now. But they were right about one thing: the barrier between worlds grows thinner each year. More lost souls, more loneliness, more people giving up hope. It feeds the hungry spirits and makes them stronger. Jacob looked at Margaret, who was kneeling beside Ayana and smoothing the child's hair. What happens now? Now, Thomas said, we make sure this little one is safe and warm, and perhaps we talk about how to heal some of the loneliness that caused tonight's trouble in the first place. She's burning up with fever. Jacob pressed his hand to little Ayana's forehead and felt heat radiating from her skin like a tiny furnace. The child had collapsed just minutes after the wolves disappeared, her small body finally giving in to weeks of cold, hunger, and fear. Margaret knelt beside them, her spirit form flickering with worry. She's been running on pure survival instinct. Now that she feels safe, her body is shutting down. Thomas Windwalker moved swiftly, gathering herbs from pouches that seemed to appear from nowhere. This happens sometimes with the young ones who live wild too long. The spirit wants to rest, but the body has forgotten how. Jacob carefully lifted Ayana and carried her to his bed, her tiny frame weighing almost nothing in his arms. Her dark hair was matted with dirt and pine needles, and her clothes were little more than rags. How had such a small person survived weeks alone in the Montana wilderness? Water, Thomas said, crushing leaves between his weathered fingers. Clean water, as hot as you can make it. Jacob rushed to fill his biggest pot from the well outside, then hung it over the fire. As the water heated, he found clean cloth and began tearing it into strips. He'd never cared for a sick child before, but something deep in his chest was driving him forward, a fierce protectiveness he'd never felt. Why do I care so much? He asked Margaret quietly. I've only known her for a few minutes. Margaret's smile was sad and knowing. Because your heart recognizes what it needs, Jacob. You've been alone so long that you forgot how good it feels to have someone depend on you. The water began to steam, and Thomas added his herbs to make a tea that smelled like pine forests and spring rain. "She needs more than medicine," the old shaman said, watching Jacob tend to the child with gentle hands. "She needs someone to believe she's worth saving." "Of course she's worth saving," Jacob said automatically. "She's just a little girl." "Yes," Thomas agreed. "And 3 hours ago, what did you think about yourself?" The question hit Jacob like a slap. 3 hours ago, he'd been convinced he was worthless. A man whose carelessness had killed his friend, whose failures had driven away everyone he'd ever loved. Now here he was, fighting supernatural wolves and caring for an orphan child as if his life depended on it. "I see the understanding in your eyes," Margaret said softly. "Helping her is helping yourself heal." Ayanna stirred on the bed, mumbling words in a language Jacob didn't recognize. Thomas moved closer and listened carefully to her feverish whispers. "She dreams of her parents," he translated. "They died in the influenza outbreak at the reservation last winter. She was supposed to be sent to a government boarding school, but she ran away instead." "Boarding school?" Jacob frowned. "What's wrong with boarding school?" Thomas's expression grew dark. "These schools are not about education, my friend. They take native children far from their families and try to make them forget who they are. Cut their hair, forbid their languages, punish them for practicing their traditions. They call it civilizing, but it's really a kind of murder, killing the spirit while leaving the body alive." Jacob felt sick. No wonder the little girl had chosen to live wild in the forest rather than go to such a place. "But she can't survive out here alone. Winter would kill her." "Yes," Thomas said simply. "She knew that. She chose to die free rather than live as someone else's idea of what she should be." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Jacob looked down at Ayanna's feverish face and saw something of himself in her determined features. She'd rather face death than lose who she was. How many times had he thought about giving up entirely rather than keep living with his guilt and loneliness? "What if?" Jacob began, then stopped. The idea forming in his mind was crazy, impossible, completely impractical. "What if what?" Margaret encouraged. "What if she stayed here? With me, I know I don't know anything about raising kids, and I'm probably the worst person to." "You're exactly the right person," Thomas interrupted. "You understand what it means to be lost. You know what it feels like when the world tells you you're worthless. Most importantly, you're willing to fight for someone who needs protection." Jacob looked around his small, rough cabin. "But this place isn't fit for a child. There's no school, no other kids to play with, no women to teach her the things girls need to know. There's something more important than all of those," Margaret said, her voice warm with approval. "There's someone who would love her just as she is." Outside, dawn was beginning to break over the mountains, painting the snow pale pink and gold. The crisis had passed, the wolves were gone, and somehow Jacob found himself considering the most important decision of his life. Ayanna's eyes fluttered open, and she looked up at him with confusion. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Jacob said gently. "You're in my cabin. Do you remember what happened?" She nodded slowly. "The bad wolves came, but grandfather made them go away." She looked around the room and spotted Thomas, who was sitting quietly by the fire. "Thank you, grandfather." "You are welcome, little one. But this man here," Thomas pointed to Jacob, "he fought for you too. Very brave, very fierce. Like a bear protecting its cub." Ayanna studied Jacob with serious dark eyes. "You fought the wolves for me? But you don't even know me." "Sometimes that doesn't matter," Jacob said, surprising himself with the truth of it. "Sometimes you fight for people just because it's the right thing to do." The little girl struggled to sit up, and Jacob helped her lean against the wall. "Where will I go now? The white men will come looking for me eventually." Thomas and Margaret exchanged a meaningful look, then both turned to stare at Jacob. The weight of their expectation pressed down on him like a physical thing. "You could stay here," Jacob said quietly, "if you wanted to. It's not much and I don't really know how to take care of kids. But you want me to stay?" Ayanna's voice was small with disbelief. "Even though I'm not white?" Even though the government men will be angry. Jacob thought about the government men who might come looking for her, about the challenges of raising a child in the wilderness, about all the ways he could fail her just like he'd failed Ben Morrison. Then he looked at her hopeful face and knew none of that mattered. "I want you to stay," he said firmly. "If that's what you want to." For the first time since he'd met her, Ayanna smiled. A real smile that lit up her whole face. "I would like that very much." But even as she spoke, the sound of approaching horses drifted through the broken window. Many horses moving fast through the forest. Someone was coming, and whoever it was, they were in a hurry. "Hide!" Thomas Windwalker's voice cracked like a whip as he pressed his ear to the door. 6 riders, maybe 7. They wear the blue coats of cavalry soldiers. Jacob's blood turned to ice. Government men, just like Ayanna had feared. They'd come to take her back to the boarding school, and they wouldn't care what she wanted or what was best for her. "Under the bed," he told Ayanna urgently. But the little girl was already moving. She'd clearly had practice hiding from searchers. Margaret's spirit form began to fade. "I can't be seen like this. If they spot me, it will raise questions you can't answer." "Wait!" Jacob grabbed for her hand, forgetting she wasn't entirely solid. "What do I tell them?" "The truth," Thomas said, pulling a worn cavalry coat from seemingly nowhere and shrugging into it. "But not all of it." Jacob stared at the old shaman in confusion. "Where did you get that uniform?" "I served as a scout for the army 20 years ago," Thomas explained, suddenly looking less mystical and more like a tired old soldier. "Some of these men might remember me. It could help." The sound of hoofbeats grew louder, accompanied by shouting voices and the jingle of metal equipment. Through the broken window, Jacob could see torches moving between the trees like angry fireflies. "They're tracking her," Thomas said grimly, "following the path she took to get here. They'll search every building, every cave, every hiding spot until they find her." Jacob's mind raced. How could he protect Ayanna from trained soldiers? He was just one man with an empty rifle and a damaged cabin. If they wanted to search his home, he couldn't stop them. "There!" a voice shouted from outside. "Light in that cabin. Someone's awake." Heavy boots crunched through the snow, growing closer with each step. Jacob quickly swept up the broken glass from the window and tossed it into the fire, where it melted and hissed. He had to make the damage look accidental, not like the result of a supernatural battle. 3 sharp knocks on the door. Different from Margaret's gentle tapping, these were aggressive and demanding. "Open up. U.S. Cavalry." Jacob took a deep breath and opened the door. A young lieutenant stood there, his blue uniform crisp despite the long ride. Behind him, 6 more soldiers sat on their horses, breath steaming in the cold air. "Sir, I'm Lieutenant Morrison. We're looking for a runaway Indian girl, about 6 years old. Have you seen anyone matching that description?" Jacob's heart nearly stopped. Morrison, the same last name as Ben, the young man who died in the logging accident. This couldn't be a coincidence. "Morrison," he managed to say, "are you related to Ben Morrison? He used to work the logging crews around here." The lieutenant's face darkened. "Ben was my younger brother. He died in an accident 18 months ago. Some careless fool let him fall from a tree." The accusation hung in the air like a sword. Jacob felt the familiar guilt crushing down on him, made worse by the fact that he was now lying to this man's face about the girl hidden under his bed. "I'm sorry for your loss," Jacob said carefully. "Ben was a good worker. Brave. Maybe too brave sometimes." "Too brave." Lieutenant Morrison's eyes narrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" Thomas stepped into view behind Jacob, his cavalry coat making him look official and trustworthy. "Lieutenant Morrison?" "Tom Windwalker, former scout. I knew your brother. He was always taking risks to prove himself. Not your friend's fault the boy wouldn't listen to safety warnings." The lieutenant's hand moved to his saber hilt. "And you are?" "Jakob Holmberg," Jacob said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I was crew chief when your brother died. I've been living up here alone since then." "Alone?" Morrison looked past them into the cabin, noting the mess from the supernatural battle. What happened to your window? Tree branch came down in the windstorm last night, Jacob lied. I was lucky it didn't take the whole wall with it. The lieutenant pushed past them and walked into the cabin, his eyes scanning every corner. The other soldiers remained outside, but Jacob could feel their presence like a weight pressing down on him. We're tracking a runaway Indian girl, Morrison said, poking at the bedding with his boot. Jacob's heart hammered as he realized how close the soldier was to Ayana's hiding spot. She escaped from the reservation 3 weeks ago. Very dangerous to be alone in this weather. Haven't seen any children, Jacob said truthfully. He'd only met Ayana a few hours ago, so technically he hadn't seen her before today. Thomas nodded agreement. These mountains are empty, Lieutenant. No place for a child to survive long. Morrison continued his search, checking behind furniture and even looking up the chimney. The tracks lead right to your door, Mr. Holmberg. Fresh tracks, made within the last few hours. Jacob's mouth went dry. Could have been an animal. Lots of wildlife moves through here at night. Could have been, Morrison agreed, but his tone suggested he didn't believe it. He walked to the bed and knelt down, preparing to look underneath. Lieutenant, Thomas said quickly, if I may ask, what's the real urgency here? One lost child in thousands of square miles of wilderness. Why bring 6 men on a night ride? Morrison paused, his hand on the edge of the blanket. Because she's not just any child. She's the granddaughter of Chief Thunder Bear, one of the last traditional leaders on the reservation. If she dies out here, it could cause trouble with the tribal council. And if she lives? Thomas asked quietly. If she lives, she goes to school like every other Indian child. Learns to be civilized, useful. Becomes American instead of savage. Jacob felt anger rising in his chest. She's 6 years old. How savage can a 6-year-old be? Morrison stood up and faced him directly. Savage enough to choose death over education, apparently. That's exactly the kind of thinking we're trying to fix. The conversation was interrupted by a shout from outside. Lieutenant! Found something. Everyone rushed to the door. One of the soldiers held up a small piece of brown cloth, torn from Ayana's dress when she'd squeezed through the broken window. Fresh tear, the soldier reported. Still has threads hanging from it. She was definitely here. Morrison turned back to Jacob with cold eyes. Where is she? Under the bed. Ayana began to cough. A small, quiet sound that might have been mistaken for a mouse. But Morrison's head snapped toward the sound like a hunting dog catching a scent. What was that? Jacob's mind went blank. They were caught. In seconds, Morrison would find Ayana, and there would be no way to explain why he'd been hiding her. The lieutenant would arrest him for harboring a fugitive, and the little girl would be dragged away to a school that would try to destroy everything that made her who she was. But then Thomas Windwalker did something unexpected. He began to cough too, a much louder, more obvious sound that filled the cabin. Sorry, he said, pounding his chest. Old lungs, cold air. Gets me every time. Morrison looked between them suspiciously, but the moment of discovery had passed. Still, Jacob knew they weren't safe. The lieutenant was smart and determined, and he wasn't going to give up easily. We'll be searching this area all day, Morrison said finally. If you see anything at all, you report it immediately. Is that understood? Understood, Jacob said. But as the soldiers mounted their horses and rode away, Jacob knew this was far from over. They'd be back, and next time they might not be so easy to fool. Under the bed, Ayana remained perfectly still, waiting for the all-clear signal that would tell her it was safe to breathe again. They're coming back, and this time they brought dogs. Jacob pressed his face to the window, watching a line of soldiers wind through the trees below his cabin. The baying of tracking hounds echoed off the mountain walls like the howls of the supernatural wolves from the night before. Ayana crawled out from under the bed, her dark eyes wide with terror. The dogs will smell me everywhere I've been. They'll know I was here. Thomas Windwalker moved to the window beside Jacob, his weathered face grim. 8 men now, plus the hounds. Lieutenant Morrison isn't giving up easily. Jacob's mind raced as he watched the search party climb the mountain path. In an hour, maybe less, those dogs would lead the soldiers straight to his door. And this time there would be no hiding Ayanna. The hounds would tear his cabin apart until they found her scent. "We have to run," he said, already moving toward his supplies. "Get her away from here before they arrive." "Where?" Margaret's spirit form shimmered back into view, her face pale with worry. "They'll track you through the snow. The dogs will follow your trail no matter where you go." "The sacred caves," Thomas said suddenly. 2 miles north, up the cliff face. The old spirits still guard that place. Dogs won't go near it, and white men fear it too much to search there. Jacob threw supplies into his pack, food, blankets, matches, his hunting knife. "Can she make that climb? She's still weak from the fever." "I can do it," Ayanna said, though her voice shook. "I climbed those rocks before, when I was running from the school men the first time." But as Jacob shouldered his pack, a terrible thought struck him. "Wait, if I run with her, I become a fugitive too. They'll put wanted posters out, send marshals after me. I'll never be able to show my face in civilization again." The words hung in the cabin like smoke. Jacob had spent months hiding from the world because of guilt and shame. Now he was choosing to hide for a completely different reason, to protect someone who needed him. "Are you having second thoughts?" Thomas asked quietly. Jacob looked at Ayanna, who was trying to braid her tangled hair with trembling fingers. Such a small person to cause such big changes in his life. 12 hours ago, he'd been a lonely hermit with nothing to live for. Now he was about to become an outlaw. "No second thoughts," he said firmly. "Let's go." But as they prepared to leave, Margaret caught his arm. "Jacob, there's something you need to know about those dogs. They're not just tracking Ayanna's scent." "What do you mean?" Margaret's expression was troubled. "I can sense things about animals, being a spirit myself. Those hounds, they smell wrong. Too eager, too focused. I think Lieutenant Morrison has done something to make them more than ordinary tracking dogs." Thomas nodded grimly. "I've heard rumors of such things. Soldiers feeding dogs blood from the people they're hunting, performing rituals to make the animals obsessed with their prey. Dark magic disguised as military tactics." Jacob felt sick. "So they won't give up? Ever?" "Not until they find what they're looking for," Thomas confirmed. "Or until something stronger than their compulsion stops them." The baying grew closer, and through the window they could see the lead dog pulling its handler up the mountain with supernatural strength. Its eyes gleamed red in the morning sunlight, and foam dripped from its jaws. "Those aren't dogs anymore," Margaret whispered. "They're hunting spirits wearing dog shapes. The barrier between worlds is still weak from last night." Morrison's ritual pulled something through. Jacob grabbed his rifle and checked his ammunition. Only 3 bullets left, and he'd already learned that normal bullets didn't work well against supernatural creatures. "The sacred caves," he said. "How far?" 2 miles through thick forest, then a 1,000-foot climb up rock face," Thomas replied. "Even if we start now, we won't make it," Jacob finished. "Not with those things on our trail." Ayanna tugged at his coat. "There's another way. The old mine shaft behind the waterfall. It leads deep into the mountain, comes out near the caves. But it's dangerous. Lots of bad air and loose rocks." "More dangerous than spirit dogs?" Jacob asked. The little girl considered this seriously. "Maybe not." Margaret moved to the door, her spirit senses reaching out into the forest. "They're half a mile away and moving fast. You have maybe 10 minutes before they reach the cabin." Jacob made his decision. "The mine it is." "Thomas, can you?" "I'll stay here," the old shaman said calmly. "Create a false trail, buy you time. These mountains are my home. I know how to confuse tracking spirits. They'll arrest you for helping us." Thomas smiled. "Let them try. I'm old, but I'm not helpless. And I have friends in these woods who remember the old agreements between my people and the land itself." Jacob wanted to argue, but the baying was getting louder and Ayanna was already at the back door, ready to run. There was no time for long goodbyes. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank me by keeping that child safe," Thomas replied. and by remembering that sometimes the most important battles aren't fought with weapons. They slipped out the back of the cabin and into the forest. Margaret's spirit form flowed beside them like mist, while Ayanna led the way with the confidence of someone who'd spent weeks learning every hidden path in these mountains. Behind them, Jacob could hear Thomas beginning to chant in his native language, old words that seemed to make the very trees lean in to listen. Whatever the shaman was doing, Jacob hoped it would be enough to throw the spirit dogs off their scent. They moved through the forest as quietly as possible, but speed was more important than stealth now. The mine entrance was hidden behind a curtain of ice-covered water that fell from the cliffs above. Getting there meant crossing two clearings where they'd be visible to anyone watching from below. There, Ayanna pointed to a dark opening barely visible behind the frozen waterfall. The mine goes deep, then splits into 3 tunnels. The middle one leads to the sacred caves. Jacob studied the entrance. It looked like a mouth opened in the mountain's face, dark and uninviting. Water had frozen into fantastic shapes around the opening, creating a barrier of ice teeth that glittered in the morning sun. "What about the other 2 tunnels?" he asked. "One goes nowhere, just ends in rocks. The other..." Ayanna's voice dropped to a whisper. "The other goes to the place where the mountain spirits sleep. Grandfather warned me never to go there." Margaret shivered. "Those spirits shouldn't feel cold. I can sense something in there. Old power, older than the wolves, older than the shamans. Something that doesn't like to be disturbed." But even as she spoke, the sound of dogs echoed across the valley. They'd reached Jacob's cabin and found his scent. In minutes, they'd be on the trail again, following the path to the waterfall. "We don't have a choice," Jacob said, shouldering his pack. "Let's hope we pick the right tunnel." They scrambled up the icy rocks toward the mine entrance. The frozen waterfall created a treacherous climbing surface, and more than once Jacob had to catch Ayanna when her feet slipped on the slick stone. Just as they reached the dark opening, a triumphant howl rose from the valley below. The dogs had found their trail and were coming fast, crashing through the forest with supernatural speed and determination. Inside, quickly, Jacob pushed Ayanna into the mine tunnel, then helped Margaret's spirit form pass through the ice barrier. As he took one last look at the outside world, he saw the lead dog break into the clearing below, a massive creature with glowing red eyes and teeth like daggers. Then he stepped into the darkness of the mountain, and the real danger began. The mine tunnel stretched ahead of them like the throat of some enormous beast, disappearing into blackness so complete that Jacob's torch seemed to barely push it back. The air smelled of old metal, stagnant water, and something else. Something organic and wrong that made his skin crawl. "Stay close," he whispered to Ayanna, who walked between him and Margaret's glowing spirit form. "And don't touch the walls unless you have to." The little girl nodded, but Jacob could see fear in her dark eyes. She'd been brave facing soldiers and spirit wolves, but there was something about this place that terrified her in a way the outside dangers hadn't. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, and their footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space. Sometimes the echoes sounded normal, but other times they seemed to repeat too many times, as if the mountain was mocking them. "How deep does this go?" Jacob asked, holding his torch higher to examine the rough-carved walls. "Nobody knows," Ayanna replied. "The white miners dug for 3 years before they found something. Then they all left very quickly and never came back." Margaret's spirit light flickered nervously. "I can feel why they left. There's something down here that doesn't belong in the world of the living." They reached the place where the tunnel split into 3 passages. Each opening looked identical, dark mouths leading into the heart of the mountain. But as Jacob held up his torch to examine them, he noticed differences. The left tunnel felt warm, with air that moved slightly. The right tunnel was cold and still, with walls that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The middle tunnel, the one Ayanna said led to the sacred caves, felt neutral, neither warm nor cold. "Are you sure about the middle one?" Jacob asked. Ayanna bit her lip uncertainly. "That's what grandfather told me, but I've never been this deep before. What if I remembered wrong?" Before Jacob could answer, a new sound reached them from the tunnel entrance behind. the scraping of claws on stone and the heavy breathing of something much larger than a normal dog. The spirit hounds had found their trail and were coming into the mine. "We have to choose now," Margaret said urgently. "I can sense at least 3 of them, and they're not slowing down." Jacob studied the 3 tunnels again, trying to think logically. The left tunnel felt warm. Maybe it led to some kind of thermal vent or underground hot spring. That could be good or bad. The right tunnel felt wrong in every way, like a place where horrible things had happened. The middle tunnel felt empty. Middle, he decided. If we're wrong, at least we'll face whatever's down there together. They plunged into the middle passage just as the first spirit hound appeared at the tunnel junction behind them. Its red eyes blazed in the darkness, and its howl of triumph echoed off the stone walls like thunder. The middle tunnel sloped steadily downward, and the air grew thicker with each step. Jacob's torch began to burn less brightly, and he worried they might run out of oxygen before finding another way out. There, Ayanna pointed ahead to where the tunnel opened into a vast underground chamber. "I think we made it." But as they emerged from the narrow passage, Jacob realized they hadn't reached the sacred caves at all. This was something else entirely. An enormous cavern filled with the remnants of the old mining operation. Rusted equipment lay scattered across the floor, and wooden support beams had collapsed into piles of rotting timber. "This isn't right," Ayanna said, her voice small with disappointment. "This isn't the way to Grandfather's caves." Margaret's spirit form grew brighter, illuminating more of the chamber. "Look," she said, pointing to the far wall. "There's another opening." Jacob raised his torch and saw she was right. A natural cave mouth opened in the rock wall opposite them, partially hidden behind fallen mining equipment. It looked older than the man-made tunnels, carved by water and time rather than picks and shovels. "Maybe that's the real way to the sacred caves," he suggested. The mine just happened to connect to a natural cave system. But even as he spoke, the sound of pursuing hounds echoed from the tunnel behind them. The spirit dogs had followed them into the mountain and were gaining ground fast. "We need to keep moving," Jacob said, leading them across the debris-filled cavern floor. "Whatever's in those caves has to be better than what's chasing us." They reached the natural cave opening just as the first spirit hound burst into the mining chamber. The creature was even more terrifying in the enclosed space. Easily the size of a small horse, with fur that seemed to absorb light and eyes that burned like coals. Jacob pushed Ayanna through the cave entrance and helped Margaret's spirit form pass through, then squeezed through himself just as the hound's claws scraped against the rock where he'd been standing. The natural cave was different from the man-made tunnel. The walls were smooth, carved by centuries of flowing water, and the air smelled clean despite being underground. Strange formations hung from the ceiling like frozen waterfalls, and pools of clear water reflected their torchlight. "It's beautiful," Ayanna breathed, her fear temporarily forgotten. Margaret nodded agreement, but her expression remained worried. "Beautiful, yes, but look at the paintings." Jacob raised his torch to examine the cave walls more carefully. Ancient drawings covered every surface. Images of animals, hunters, ceremonies, and strange symbols that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. "Sacred cave paintings," Ayanna said with wonder. "Grandfather told me about these, but I never thought I'd see them." The paintings told a story that unfolded as they moved deeper into the cave. Hunters pursuing great beasts, shamans calling on spirit powers, battles between forces of light and darkness, and everywhere, repeated over and over, the image of a great mountain with something sleeping in its heart. "What does it mean?" Jacob asked. Ayanna studied the symbols with the seriousness of someone much older. "It's the story of the first sleep," she said, "when the old spirits went to rest so the new world could be born. But they're not gone, just sleeping, waiting for a time when they're needed again." Behind them, the spirit hounds howled with frustration as they tried to squeeze through the cave entrance. The opening was too narrow for their enlarged forms, but Jacob could hear them clawing at the rock, trying to widen it. "They'll get through eventually," Margaret warned. "We need to find another way out." The cave passage wound deeper into the mountain, following what had once been an underground river. The paintings became more elaborate as they progressed, showing ceremonies and rituals that must have taken place in these very chambers. Then they reached a place where the passage opened into another large cavern, and Jacob's torch illuminated something that made his blood freeze. Skeletons lay scattered across the cavern floor. Human skeletons, still wearing the rotted remains of mining clothes. Some clutched pickaxes in their bony hands, others had fallen while trying to crawl toward the exit. "The miners," Jacob whispered. "The ones who left so quickly. They didn't all make it out." Margaret's spirit light revealed more details. "Look at their faces," she said quietly. "The ones that still have faces. They died terrified." The skull nearest to them had its jaw stretched wide in a silent scream, and its empty eye sockets seemed to stare at something behind them. Other skeletons were curled into defensive positions, as if trying to protect themselves from an attack. "What killed them?" Ayana asked, pressing close to Jacob's side. Before anyone could answer, a new sound reached them from the depths of the cavern. Something that wasn't quite breathing, wasn't quite wind, but sounded like both. And with it came a presence that made the spirit wolves seem like harmless puppies. Something vast and ancient was waking up in the heart of the mountain. Something that didn't like visitors. Something that had been sleeping for a very long time and was very, very hungry. The cave paintings suddenly made terrible sense. This wasn't just a sacred place, it was a prison. And they had just walked into the cell of something that should never be allowed to escape.